Jay Silverheels made history as the very first Native American person to play a Native American character on TV. He became super famous playing a character named Tonto in a show called The Lone Ranger. But behind the camera, when nobody was watching, something was really, really wrong. In 1957, someone asked him about playing his most famous character. He only said 3 words in response: "Tonto is stupid." That wasn't the only secret he was keeping from fans. He was paid only half the money that his white acting partner earned for doing the same job. One time, a movie director actually tried to physically hurt him while they were filming, and the name Tonto itself meant something really bad that he could never get away from. Today, we're going to uncover and learn about what really happened to the man who smiled for the cameras, but was hurting and suffering on the inside when nobody could. See, Jay Silverheels was born with the name Harold J. Smith on May 26, 1912. He was born on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, which is near a town called Hagersville in Ontario, Canada. He came from a really big Mohawk family. He was one of at least 10 kids all packed together in one small house, so you can imagine how crowded it must have been. His father's name was Alexander George Edwin Smith, and he was a Kanien'kehá:ka war hero. That means he was a brave soldier who fought in World War I and earned something called the Military Cross for being incredibly brave during a battle at the Somme and Arras. But when the war ended and he came back home, he was damaged and hurt. The loud sounds from the big war guns had made him deaf. He was stuck working on a farm and trying to survive on only $49 a month from the Canadian government. That's barely any money at all. His war medals and awards didn't put food on the table or feed his family. His injuries and pain from the war never went away or got better. Every single day, Harold watched his father suffer from terrible headaches and hearing problems. His mother's name was Mabel. She was part Mohawk and part Seneca, which are 2 different Native American nations. She carried all the responsibility and weight of keeping the house running and the family together. She used traditional native medicine to help her family because doctors wouldn't even agree to see them or treat them. They couldn't afford to pay for much of anything, and what little they did have came from the land they lived on, trading things with other people, or using herbal knowledge passed down through generations. Poverty and being really poor wrapped around their lives right from the very start, like a heavy blanket they couldn't shake off. By the time Harold was only 5 years old, he was already showing signs that he had amazing athletic talent. He would race around playing in local lacrosse matches on the reserve. Lacrosse is a sport that was invented by Native American people long ago. By the time he turned 19 years old, he was playing box lacrosse professionally for a team called the Toronto Tecumsehs. He used the name Harry Smith back then. He didn't go and travel alone. His cousins and brothers, who had nicknames like Porky, Beef, and Chubby, were right there traveling with him. They went to cities like Buffalo, Rochester, Atlantic City, and many other places beyond. They played lacrosse games almost non-stop all through the 1930s, earning money, dodging and escaping poverty, and building up a reputation and name for themselves. That name eventually became Silverheels. The name was given to Harold after he sprinted and ran past a defender so incredibly quickly that it looked like his shoes were flashing silver in the light. The name just stuck with him. Newspapers started writing it in their stories. Fans would show up to games just to watch him run. During one season, he scored more than 4 goals per game on average, and coaches started putting 2 men on him just to try to guard and stop him. But being famous in sports didn't mean he had freedom from the unfair system around him. Harold grew up during a time when Canada had something called residential schools that tried to completely erase and destroy Indigenous languages and culture. At Six Nations, students were beaten and hit if they spoke Mohawk, which was their own language. Some kids were fed soap as punishment or strapped with belts. Harold's own sister was sent away to one of these residential schools, and when she came back home, she couldn't even speak her own language properly anymore. Families were torn apart and destroyed by government policies that banned native ceremonies and traditions, punished their spirituality and beliefs, and pushed them into silence where they couldn't speak up. Government officials called Native people lazy, They said Native people lacked the ability to compete with white people. That horrible message didn't just stay in government reports. It lingered and stuck around in everyday life, in how people looked at Native Americans, talked about them, and treated them like they were less than human. When the Great Depression hit America and Canada in the 1930s, which was a time when lots of people lost their jobs and became very poor, Harold's family, like so many other families, sank even deeper into poverty. They had to move to Buffalo, which is a city in New York. Harold worked all kinds of odd jobs that didn't pay well. He labored and worked hard on farms, and he did whatever it took just to survive and help his family. His father, even though he was a decorated war veteran with medals, could barely move his body without feeling terrible pain. His mother had to barter and trade away family heirlooms, special things that had been in the family for years, just to get food for everyone to eat. The government food rations they received were often spoiled and rotten. Harold watched his parents give up absolutely everything they had just to keep the lights on in their house. That kind of deep poverty didn't just make people's stomachs hurt from hunger. It made people feel like they didn't exist, like they didn't matter to anyone. Still, Harold kept pushing forward and didn't give up. His incredible speed on the lacrosse field started opening up new doors for him. In 1932, he went professional and played lacrosse for money, $75 per game, which was actually big cash during the Depression when most people had almost nothing. In one game that took place in Montreal, a rough foul that broke the rules sparked a huge brawl and fight. Harold threw punches at other players, and that got him suspended from playing for a while. But when he came back to play again, something amazing happened. Ticket sales tripled. That means 3 times as many people bought tickets. People wanted to see him play, even if it meant there would be controversy and drama. He made headlines in the newspapers. He just kept going and never stopped. Then boxing came into Harold's life. Harold fought as a middleweight boxer in the famous Golden Gloves tournament at Madison Square Garden, which is a huge, famous arena in New York City. He made it all the way to the semifinals, which means he was one of the final 4 fighters left. But then he took a brutal, terrible punch that broke his jaw in 2 different places. The injury ended his boxing dreams right there. But the prize money he won kept him afloat financially and helped him survive. He lost nearly 25 pounds because he could only eat liquid food while his jaw healed. But he didn't quit on life. That boxing fight taught him an important lesson about how to take pain and just keep moving forward no matter what. In 1937, he went on tour to Los Angeles with his lacrosse team. One day, while he was sprinting and running at a place called Gilmore Stadium, a comedian named Joe E. Brown noticed him and thought he was amazing. Joe offered him a small role in a film. Harold performed a stunt where he did a diving catch, and it took 11 tries to get it exactly right for the camera. He was paid $150 for that work. That was twice as much money as lacrosse paid him. From there, things started to shift and change. He got something called a Screen Actors Guild card, which is like a membership that lets you be a professional actor. He started calling himself J. Silverheels instead of Harold Smith. By the end of that year, he'd appeared in 5 different films. He wasn't a big star yet, but he was in the door. He had made it into Hollywood. Hollywood didn't roll out a fancy red carpet for him like they do for some actors. He worked as a stuntman, which means he did dangerous things for movies. He was earning less than $20 a day, and he had to wait tables at restaurants at night just to survive and pay for food and rent. But in 1939, he landed a real acting role in a movie called Drums Along the Mohawk. It paid him $350 a week, which was more money than he'd ever made in his entire life. Studios and movie companies liked the name Silverheels. They told him to use it as his official name. They said it sounded exotic and interesting. He took on small roles in movies, mostly playing Native Americans who didn't even have names in the script. Casting directors, the people who decide who gets to be in movies, made him take off his shirt and stand there like he was on display at a store. They judged how his body looked more than they judged his acting skills. Still, he showed up to every audition, learned all his lines, and kept getting more work. In 1941, he finally got a speaking role, where he actually had words to say. By that time, he'd been in more than 15 different films, but usually he wasn't even credited. That means his name didn't appear in the list of actors. He played characters like Indian Scout or Warrior Number 2, but he never, ever gave up on his dream. He studied Shakespeare, who was a famous writer from hundreds of years ago who wrote really hard plays. A friend told Jay, "If you can read Shakespeare, you can read anything." He didn't think Shakespeare was for him at first, but he learned it anyway because he wanted to become a better actor. He served in World War II as a soldier, though the records and information about what he did are pretty thin and hard to find. In 1945, after the war ended, he returned to Hollywood with a new version of his name, J. Silverheels. But the movie industry hadn't changed at all while he was gone. Native American actors were still being pushed aside and ignored. White actors would put on makeup to pretend to be Native American instead of hiring real Native people. There were very few roles available, and the ones that did exist were insulting and stereotypical. In 1946, he auditioned for a movie called Captain from Castile. He actually starved himself so his fancy suit would fit better for the audition. The director made him take off his shirt, just like usual. It was humiliating and embarrassing, but he got the part in the movie. The film didn't make much money and flopped financially, but at least he had a job. Still, even when he had lines to speak, he stayed uncredited. His name didn't appear in the credits. He traveled all across the South with his lacrosse team during a time when racism was loud, obvious, and inescapable everywhere. Hotels would turn him away and refuse to let him stay there. Restaurants wouldn't serve him food. He had to sleep on buses while his white teammates got comfortable rooms in hotels. Once, in a city called Louisville, police officers actually threatened him just for using a bathroom that had a sign that said, "Whites Only." These kinds of things weren't rare events that only happened once in a while. They were constant and happened all the time. That's why later in his life, when he finally had a platform and some fame in Hollywood, he used his voice and influence to fight for better roles and representation for Native American people. A whole decade, that's 10 years, passed before anyone in Hollywood really noticed him in a big way. That all changed in 1948 when a famous director named John Huston cast him in a movie called Key Largo. He acted alongside huge stars like Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Jay played a character named Tom Osceola, who was a Seminole fugitive. Finally, he had a credited role in a major studio film. That means his name appeared in the credits for everyone to see. They shot the movie on the Warner Brothers back lot in Burbank, California for 78 days. They built a fake Florida setting in a controlled environment to keep the costs low and save money. But for Jay, it meant something way more important. He was climbing out of the shadows. He was no longer just another name lost in the background where nobody noticed him. 2 years later, in 1950, Jay was cast in a movie called Broken Arrow. It was a Western movie that claimed to be progressive and fair, but it couldn't quite let go of old, bad habits. He played Geronimo, who was a real historical figure and a strong character. But he wasn't the main star. That lead role went to Jeff Chandler, who was a white actor from Brooklyn. Jeff wore dark makeup to portray Cochise, who was a famous Apache leader. Even in a film that tried to present Native Americans more fairly and respectfully, Hollywood just couldn't bring itself to let real Native American actors be the leads and stars. Real Apache people were hired as background extras from the Fort Apache Reservation. Jay, who was a Canadian Mohawk, not Apache, gave the character of Geronimo dignity and respect. But the contradiction wasn't lost on anyone who was paying attention. Then came the moment that changed his entire life and changed TV history forever. In 1949, when a show called The Lone Ranger came to ABC television, Silverheels beat out 35 other actors to become Tonto. The show first aired on September 15th. For the very first time ever, a Native American person played a Native American character on television. For 2 whole decades before that, that's 20 years, The radio version of Tonto had been voiced by white men like John Todd and Roland Parker. Even when TV producers thought about maybe casting a real native actor, they hesitated and weren't sure. One native actor was actually fired from the role just because he refused to speak in broken, incorrect English that sounded stereotypical. They went back to John Todd before they finally gave Jay the job. At that time in Hollywood, the standard practice was to paint Italian actors with something called Armenia Bowl Red Clay to make them look native enough. Jay's casting broke that terrible mold. He wasn't supposed to win the part based on how Hollywood usually did things, but he did win it, and it changed absolutely everything. There was always a big problem with the name Tonto. The word tonto actually means fool or stupid in Spanish. Silverheels knew this fact. He lived with that knowledge every single day. In public and on camera, he smiled and seemed happy. But privately, when the cameras were off, he resented it and hated it. In 1957, during a visit back to his home reserve in Ontario, Canada, someone asked him about his famous role. His answer was really quick and short. "Tonto is stupid." That was all he said. Just 3 words. But behind those 3 simple words was a whole decade of quiet frustration that had been building up inside him. The name stuck and stayed around. Through the decades, even as Native American groups pointed out how offensive and insulting it was. When Johnny Depp played Tonto in a movie in 2013, the controversy came back all over again. Nothing had changed in all those years. And it wasn't just the name that was a problem. Jay had a reputation for never reading his lines exactly as they were written in the script, not because he was lazy or didn't care, but because the lines were often really bad. They were stiff and written in broken English that was supposed to sound authentic, but was actually just stereotypical and insulting. So instead, he would improvise and make things up as he went along. He'd say things like, "Me wait here, you go into town." That right. Those simple phrases stuck in people's memories. Directors would get absolutely furious with him. Alan Dinehart, who worked on the show, remembered how one director named William Thiele went red with rage and anger. He had to be physically held back by other people to stop him from attacking Jay on the set in 1955. But Clayton Moore, who played the Lone Ranger himself, defended his co-star and partner. "Let it play," he'd say to the directors. "It sounds more natural that way." Jay had a really good point. He knew how people really spoke in real life, but Hollywood didn't want that reality. They wanted a stereotype, and he was forced to deliver it whether he liked it or not. Behind the scenes, when the cameras weren't rolling, things weren't much better for Jay. The budget for each episode of the show was only $12,500, so the producers cut corners everywhere to save money. Jay and Clayton Moore didn't even have proper dressing rooms at the beginning of the show. They had to change their clothes in a gas station restroom down the road from where they were filming. Can you imagine that? The heat on location was absolutely brutal and terrible, especially in Chatsworth, California, where they filmed a lot. The suede and wool costumes they had to wear turned into ovens in the hot sun. Jay finally had enough of it. One day, he just refused to get dressed. He stood there waiting. Clayton Moore warned him that delaying the shoot could cost people their jobs because they wouldn't finish on time. But Jay wouldn't budge or give in. The very next day, private dressing rooms appeared for both of them. It was a small win, but it meant something important. It showed Jay had some power. Jay could have just accepted the fame and been happy with being on TV. He was a star now, after all. The Lone Ranger was one of the top shows on television. It ranked number 7 in the Nielsen ratings for the 1950-51 season and stayed in the top 30 shows for many years after that. Over 8 seasons, they made 221 episodes. That's a lot of TV. But Jay never forgot what it cost him personally. He didn't like what Tonto had become as a character. He didn't like being the sidekick who always spoke in broken, choppy sentences. In real life, he was fluent in English, articulate, and sharp. But the show didn't let him show that part of himself. Then something scary happened that stopped the show completely for a while. In 1955, during a fight scene rehearsal, a stuntman fell onto Jay. Clayton Moore saw something was off and wrong. Jay was walking in a strange way. Moore followed him back to his trailer and found him clutching his chest in pain. It was a heart attack. Despite being an athlete who had played lacrosse and boxed in the Golden Gloves, Jay was a heavy smoker, which means he smoked lots of cigarettes. He missed 8 whole weeks of work while recovering from his heart attack. During that time, the show introduced a new character named Dan Reed to fill the gap and take Tonto's place in the stories. The writers explained Tonto's absence by saying he was in Washington, D.C. meeting the Great White Father, which was a way of referring to the president. That line actually said way more than the writers probably realized about how Native Americans were seen. At home, away from Hollywood, Jay was just Harold Smith. He married a woman named Mary DeMora in 1945. Together they had 4 children, Jay Jr., Marilyn, Pamela, and Karen. From his first marriage to a woman named Bobby Smith, he had 2 more children, Steve and Gail. That's 6 kids total. He liked to joke about his family's mixed heritage. On The Tonight Show once, he said he married an Italian woman to get back at Christopher Columbus for discovering America. He called their kids Indelians, a mix of Indian and Italian. But the joke actually hid something way deeper. Jay's grandfather had been a Mohawk chief. He grew up on the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. Hollywood's version of what an Indian was supposed to be was a really long way from the truth he carried with him every day. In 1953, Jay Silverheels took on the role of Setanta, a Kiowa chief in a movie called War Arrow. It wasn't the lead role, but it placed him alongside big Hollywood names like Maureen O'Hara and Jeff Chandler. Filming stretched from early March through April. They shot it across Arizona in places like Nogales and Sonoita's Empire Ranch, plus a few scenes in California's Agoura. What started as a solid action Western ended up being trimmed down and changed by the director, George Sherman. He took out several action sequences and replaced them with talkie scenes, where characters explained the action instead of showing it happening. Even the studio admitted later that this decision made the film weaker and not as good. Still, the movie had strong stunt scenes and rich Technicolor visuals that looked beautiful. Maureen O'Hara would later say that Chandler was nice as a person, but he didn't impress her much as an actor. Silverheels' character stood on the opposite side of the central conflict in the story. It was a reminder of how native roles were usually positioned, just outside the main focus, but still present in the background. The following year, in 1954, he played another supporting role in a movie called Drums Across the River. This time, he played a character named Taos in a Western directed by Nathan Juran and starring Audie Murphy. It was shot in Technicolor in some of California's most scenic and beautiful spots, including Barton Flats and Red Rock Canyon. Murphy played a young man trying to stop a war with the Ute tribe while being accused of a crime he didn't actually commit. Silverheels' role wasn't just background scenery. His character represented the native voice in a story about land disputes and rising tensions between different groups. The film had intense horseback scenes and fights, and what one critic called a leap of death stunt that really stood out and got people's attention. These kinds of physical, action-packed scenes came naturally to Silverheels, who had once been a professional lacrosse player and a boxer. Morris Ankrum joined him on screen as Chief Urey in a production that cost around $1 million, which was a really big budget at that time. After the Lone Ranger series wrapped up filming in 1956 and stopped airing new episodes by 1957, Silverheels came back as Tonto in 2 theatrical movies that played in actual movie theaters. First came The Lone Ranger in 1956, then The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold in 1958. The second film was 81 minutes long and shot in Eastman color by United Artists Studio. He acted alongside Clayton Moore once again. The film did fine. It wasn't a huge hit, but it wasn't a complete flop either. What did hit hard and hurt was what came after those movies ended. The role of Tonto had made him famous all across America, but it also boxed him in and limited what he could do. From that point forward, most of what he got offered were similar Native American roles that were often thin, stereotypical, and didn't give him much to do. It was the kind of typecasting that slowly dried up his options and made it harder to get different kinds of work. In the 1960s, he kept showing up in Western movies and TV guest spots on shows like Wagon Train, Wanted, Dead or Alive, Rawhide, Laramie, Daniel Boone, and The Virginian. But almost always, he played the same kind of character over and over. Even when he delivered solid, good performances, he rarely got the recognition or variety of roles he deserved. He appeared on Daniel Boone 3 different times between 1964 and 1965, playing roles that barely gave him any dialogue or words to speak. While filming The Lone Ranger, he earned about $100,000 per season. In today's money, that would be around $850,000, which sounds like a lot. But it was still just half of what Clayton Moore was making for playing the lead character. That pay gap, the difference in what white actors and Native actors earned, followed him through most of his career. As the 1960s moved forward, so did the Native American rights movement. And with that movement came criticism, not from Hollywood executives, but from within Native communities themselves. Activists started calling out how Native characters, like Tonto, reinforced old, harmful stereotypes that made Native people look bad. One scholar called Tonto an Indian step-and-fetch-it, which was a reference to a racist character from old movies. Russell Means, a leader of the American Indian movement, used Tonto as an insult, similar to how Uncle Tom was used in Black communities to describe someone who went along with racism. Silverheels found himself caught between 2 worlds, the fame he'd earned and the problematic image that fame was built on. He started to disappear from TV screens, not because he wanted to, but because networks and studios got nervous about backlash and criticism. Even his past success couldn't protect him from the changing climate and attitudes. But instead of fading away quietly or going silent, he turned toward something more lasting and important. In the early 1960s, he helped co-found the Indian Actors Workshop in Los Angeles. It started at the LA Indian Center with help from Buffy Sainte-Marie, Iron Eyes Cody, and Rod Redwing. By 1966, it had become a real fixture in the community, holding weekly classes and giving Native actors a place to train, rehearse, and develop their acting skills. One of those future actors was Michael Horse, who later played Tonto in The Legend of the Lone Ranger in 1981, and became well known for his role in the TV show Twin Peaks. In 1973, Silverheels said their main goal was to unlock the dormant creativity inside Native communities. That means to wake up and bring out the creative talent that was sleeping inside people. He didn't just say it, he actually built it and made it happen. Back in the late 1930s, while working as a stuntman and background actor in Hollywood, Jay Silverheels married Bobby Smith. Their marriage fell apart and ended by 1943. Around the same time, his life was really unstable. He was juggling film work that wasn't steady and military service during World War II. He was often away from home performing dangerous stunts for films like The Seahawk and Western Union, earning barely enough to live on just about $50 to $75 a week. The divorce left him separated and estranged from his 2 children, Steve and a daughter whose name varies in different records. Sometimes she's listed as Gail and sometimes as Sharon. Jay's limited income, constant travel for work, and the legal complications of being in the military during wartime made it nearly impossible for him to stay in close contact with these kids. A couple of years later, in 1945 or 1946, Jay married Mary DeMora. She was an Italian-American woman. He once joked that he married her just to get back at Christopher Columbus. He called their children Indelians as a funny nickname. They had 4 children together, Jay Jr., Marilyn, Pamela, and Karen. The family settled down in Canoga Park, California. In 1949, Jay landed the role that would define his entire public image, Tonto in The Lone Ranger. It brought him fame and recognition, but not fortune or wealth. Contracts back in those days didn't offer much in the way of long-term pay or residuals, and being so deeply typecast meant that Tonto was both a breakthrough opportunity and a trap at the same time. Even after the show ended in 1957, he was constantly boxed into roles that looked and sounded exactly like Tonto. He had that heart attack in 1955 while filming and missed 8 weeks of work, which didn't help his already strained finances. Still, he and Mary remained together until his death, navigating and dealing with all the ups and downs of a long and unstable career in Hollywood. By the early 1960s, Jay began thinking seriously about how Native Americans were represented in Hollywood movies and TV shows. More importantly, he thought about who got to represent them and play those roles. He started quietly supporting a project that would become official in 1966, the Indian Actors Workshop. It was his way of doing something concrete and real, instead of just protesting from the outside. He believed that boycotts, when people refused to buy something or watch something to make a point, wouldn't work for Native Americans the way they had worked for African Americans. He said a boycott by Indians would not mean the loss of money that a Negro boycott could bring. So instead, he focused on what he could actually control: training actors. Alongside Noble Kid Chisel and William Bassett, Jay taught acting, voice work, stunt techniques, and even nutrition to aspiring Native actors who wanted to break into Hollywood. They held weekly sessions at places like the Los Angeles Indian Center and a Methodist church in Echo Park. The goal was crystal clear: to help Native actors get into the Screen Actors Guild, to land better roles, and to gradually shift and change how studios saw Native American people. Not everyone appreciated this approach or thought it was the right way. Activists like Russell Means saw Tonto as a symbol of everything wrong with how Native people were shown in movies. The character was mocked as an Indian step-and-fetch-it, and the word Tonto even became a slur within activist circles. But Jay stuck to his path and his beliefs. He believed that real change would come not from yelling at the gates of Hollywood, but from getting Native people through those gates and into the industry. He even ran a letter-writing campaign to President Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon, and top TV executives, urging them to create better portrayals of Native Americans on screen. The workshop also tackled broader community issues beyond just acting, like alcohol abuse and care for elderly people. It wasn't just about getting acting jobs. It was about identity, pride, and survival for the whole community. As the 1970s rolled in, Jay took on a second career that had nothing to do with acting: harness racing. That's a sport where horses pull a small cart with a driver. He earned a provisional driver's license in 1974 and trained horses at Hollywood Park Racetrack. He enjoyed jogging the horses around the track, and his fame from acting helped promote races when he went on tour back east in 1973 and 1974. One of the horses he was later honored with, a horse named Hi-Ho, Silverheels after his famous character, broke a track record at Los Alamitos Racetrack in 1996. Jay's widow Mary and his son Jay Jr. were there to witness it and celebrate, but by then, Jay himself had long been gone. In 1975, just as more serious and dignified roles were finally starting to come his way after years of waiting, he suffered a series of strokes. A stroke is when blood flow to part of the brain gets blocked, and it can cause serious damage. In 1976, another major stroke severely affected his speech, making it very hard for him to talk. On July 17, 1979, just months before his death, he received his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. That's the famous sidewalk in Hollywood where celebrities get their names written in the concrete. He attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, surrounded by Native American dancers in traditional clothing. He could barely mumble just a few words of thanks. It was a quiet, bittersweet moment for a man who had spoken so loudly and powerfully with his actions throughout his life. On March 5, 1980, Jay Silverheels died at age 67. The cause was complications from that stroke and pneumonia at a hospital in Calabasas, California. Pneumonia is a serious lung infection. He was cremated, which means his body was burned into ashes. His ashes were returned to the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada, where he was born so many years before. His son, Jay Silverheels Jr., picked up the family mantle and pursued acting just like his father. He appeared in The Legend of the Lone Ranger in 1981, a film that was plagued by so many production problems and issues that it became a cautionary tale, a warning story in Hollywood. The lead actor's entire voice had to be dubbed over by another actor. The original Lone Ranger actor, Clayton Moore, was legally blocked from wearing the character's famous mask in public, which caused a huge media storm. The film flopped so badly at the box office that its star never acted in another movie again. Still, Jay Jr. continued working in television, trying to walk the same difficult line his father had walked, being proud of being Native, being visible in Hollywood, and pushing for better roles for Native American actors. Back in 1966, when Jay officially launched the Indian Actors Workshop, he said its main purpose was to tap into the dormant creativity of the Indians. That creativity didn't stay dormant or asleep for long at all. In the years after his death, the workshop's influence could be felt and seen in the rise of talented Native actors like Graham Greene, who was nominated for an Oscar for his role in Dances with Wolves. It could be seen in films like Smoke Signals in 1998, which was the very first feature film written, directed, and produced entirely by Native Americans. Jay's name is literally carved into the concrete of Hollywood on the Walk of Fame, and his influence lives on in the legacy of Native cinema. He was posthumously inducted, which means, after his death, into the Western Performers Hall of Fame in 1993, and the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame in 1997 under the name Harry Tonto Smith. His portrait still hangs in Buffalo's Shays Performing Arts Center. His influence shows up in every Indigenous storyteller today who demands more than a stereotypes and chooses to speak, act, and write on their own terms, telling their own stories their own way. And even though he once said he cringed inside every single time he had to deliver Tonto's broken English lines, he never let bitterness or anger stop him from moving forward. On The Tonight Show in 1969, he came out dressed as Tonto, looked straight at the camera with confidence, and said, "My name is Tonto. I hail from Toronto, and I speak Esperanto. Esperanto is a made-up language, so it was a joke." Even when the lines he had to speak weren't his own words, even when he was forced to play,